Welcome everyone. Great to see so many of you here, and I know that we've had lots of requests from people for whom the timing just doesn't work, so we know there'll be a lot of people watching this on kind of catch up, as it were, later on as well. So really pleased to be in contact with so many of you. Today's program, really, we've got 4 sessions today, and the sort of shape of the day is to step back a bit and look at the issues around well-being and try and make some sense of what's going on, and also to get a feel for what we might be able to do differently. And so my session is in that category. And then zooming in a bit to really quite practical and applied approaches to addressing some of the issues that come up and that we see on a daily basis across schools. Mike Armiger's session directly after this does that. And again, in the later in the day, in the afternoon from 12:30, starting further out with a wider perspective of well-being in society, before zooming back in to understand some particular strategies that have been put to use in Carmarthenshire. So the sort of shape of the day, I suppose, is to come out and into the issues, and hopefully at each stage within that, there will be some really practical and applied tools and thoughts that you can take away and use. So I hope that sort of structure works for you today. One of the things I'd encourage you to do as participants today is to use the chat function. It's a little bit artificial. You know, I wish we were in a room and we could stop for coffee and share experiences, or just raise a knowing eyebrow when a particular conversation topic comes up. But that's not how things are. So the best we've got is the chat function. And so, you know, if there are thoughts you have, if there's something a speaker says and you think I really relate to that, or, do you know, actually I have a completely opposite perspective on this. Any of the comments or observations that you make are really useful and kind of enrich the whole experience, because I think it makes it easier for all of us to relate to what's going on. And as colleagues have said, if some of the content sparks questions, as the question occurs to you, stick it into the chat function. Colleagues will be sifting through. If there is loads of chat, they'll find the questions and make sure we address them at the end. Anyway, I should stop blathering about how we do this, shouldn't I, and just get on with actually doing it. So I'm going to start with an introduction to the charity. For anyone who hasn't come across us before, Education Support has been around for 143 years, since 1877. And we exist to improve the mental health and well-being of everyone working in education. All that time ago, we were founded by teachers for teachers, and that being of service to the profession. And now our definition of teacher is wider. We talk about educators because we want to speak to everybody in the education workforce. But we are still here to work with all of you. That's what our function in life is. And the mission of the charity is underpinned by one key belief, and it is this: that better well-being leads to better education. Now, that shouldn't really be terribly controversial, you'd say. And as you know, over the last 5 years, we've seen a huge shift actually in attitudes toward understanding the relevance and significance of well-being in all aspects of society, and particularly in education. So there is real progress being made on this agenda at this stage. But our whole reason for being is to try and affect policy and move well-being more to the centre of policy, not just in relation to our children and young people, where there's been a really strong focus, but speaking to that piece, which is our workforce. Because of course, if our workforce isn't in good shape, it's impossible to expect that they're going to be able to do the best for the students and young people that they're supporting and teaching. So that's what we're all about. I'm going to just talk to you relatively quickly. I'll fire up a few graphs here. If you're interested in the content, we've got all this stuff on our website. We've got lots of research reports. You can be in contact with us. I know when you registered for this event, you'll have had an email from my colleague Jen, who introduced me. And if there's any of this stuff that you want, we can email it out to you. So don't feel like you need to study these graphs too deeply or try and take it all in. But I'm trying to paint a picture, really, and one that'll be probably fairly familiar to you. before we talk about well-being in a COVID context, I think it's really important to understand the wider picture on well-being for the education workforce. And so I'm going to present to you now some of the data, just a couple of graphs from the data we collect on an annual basis that is looking at the well-being of the workforce. And so this data set comes from 2017 through to 2019. Next month, we'll be producing the 2020 update. But what you see here, and if we look at school leaders in particular, in 2017, we had 3/4 of school leaders reporting stress and reporting themselves as being stressed. In 2018, it increased, and in 2019, it increased again, up to 84% of the school leadership community. Now, we're talking about acute stress in when we're asking these questions, but I think when you step back and look at the data over 3 years, if you have 3 years worth of people citing acute stress, then you start to be concerned, obviously, about chronic stress. And so this picture, particularly for senior leaders, and this is across the United Kingdom, this data comes from, and I will say that the picture for Wales is slightly less grim. England particularly drags down some of the numbers on senior leaders, although in Scotland we also see high levels of stress. So in Wales it's a little bit better, but there is still a picture of stress across the leadership community. So that's the kind of background that we come into COVID with. I'm not going to get into teachers and other roles, but we're seeing, increasing stress there, and not so much here, though the base is high to start with. What is sitting behind that? Well, we talk to people across the workforce and ask them what is driving that stress. And the work-related issues that people cite are these. There's a lot of data on this graph. I should really have simplified it, but try not to don't get too engrossed in it. But I think the things to note are that over each of the last 3 years, actually, work-life balance has been a big issue for the education workforce, alongside excessive workload. And of course, those two things go neatly together. Then we hear about pupil and student behaviour, and increasingly we're hearing about parent behaviour being an issue. But after that, you come back to things related to workload and the work environment again. So unreasonable demands from managers, I think, probably is quite closely correlated with the nature of workload. And issues like inspections or curriculum change play also into generating workload. So there's a lot of stuff about workload here and work-life balance. I suppose the net effect, if we step back from it, the thing that we talk to policymakers about that does concern us is the extent of mental health impact that this workload seems to have on our education workforce. So in 2019, we had 78% of all education professionals citing that they had experienced at least one behavioural, physical or psychological symptom of mental ill health as a result of their work. That's quite a shocking statistic, I think. And that is significantly higher than we see in other professions, and significantly higher than in the general population. Again, I would draw your attention to the fact that this is UK-wide data coming up to this 78%. The picture in Wales is slightly less bad, and that's good for you. But it's still above the national average. So that's the background that we have. And a kind of a key indicator for us is something called the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, which we measure the health of the education workforce against this. And it gives us a number and we can track it over time. So, everybody involved in research loves a number they can pin things on, and we're no different from anyone else in that way. You don't need to know loads about the scale. There's 14 questions that lead to it. It's commonly used to look and track the well-being of populations. But when we ran it for the UK, we found that the score of 44.7 was the overall well-being score for UK educators. And that is significantly below the UK population more generally. When we looked at Welsh educators, this plays into what I've just been suggesting. Actually, Welsh educators had a higher score. They were closer to the general population, and that's a good thing. But there's still a gap even in Wales. So the Welsh general population, for example, has a better level of well-being than the English general population. But there is still a material gap here between our Welsh educators and the Welsh general population. And that's the context into which we step with COVID. You will all know and will have experienced just how severe the impact of COVID is and how even unevenly felt it has been across the country. We don't need to get into the natures of the nature of the impact, but apart from the direct health consequences for people, of course, we've seen anxiety, people's concerns and fear for their own health, for the health of their loved ones, and we've seen the economic and social fallout that has come alongside the attempts to contain the virus. So the effects are many and varied, and as many of us anticipate going into the winter, those effects will become even more felt, I think, across our communities. We did some research at the end of the first lockdown, so in July, talking to the education workforce and wanting to understand what their experience had been of lockdown and of this COVID, this whole kind of COVID era, if you like. And the reason we undertook that research was we thought if we can understand how this has been for educators, well, then we're in a better place to be able to support them as the pandemic sort of carries on through its own life cycle. So that's what's sat behind the research. Again, don't worry about if you want to see the detailed research, and there's a full report, you can find it on Twitter under that hashtag. It's on our website on this address. Don't be scribbling this down, we can email it to you. But it's also on our own website. You can scroll down to the bottom of our homepage, and then there's a link to latest research. Again, Jennifer can send you all of the links to this stuff, so don't feel like you need to capture it. And actually, I'm not going to talk you through loads of the data. I'm going to talk you through the kind of highlights of the findings from that research. So the highlight is perhaps not the right word. The headline finding from the research is that the mental health of the education workforce has been significantly impacted by COVID. 52% of the workforce felt that the experience of lockdown and the pandemic had a negative impact on their mental health. So that again is higher than the general population. The Mental Health Foundation released some research at the end of last week, and they've been tracking the general population over time. And their research shows that most people have digested the stress related to this situation, reasonably well. And are integrating the experience. They're able to kind of make sense of it and cope with it fairly well. And that's true also of the education population, but I think because of the specific pressures on this workforce in being to the extent that schools are on the front line, right square facing into the pandemic, it has taken a toll on the workforce. So that's a headline finding and something that is underpinning, I think, for example, Welsh Government are funding this piece of work. Through the rest of this project, we are hoping to go out and work with schools. We want to work and support school leaders. We'll be inviting you to get in touch if you want to participate in that programme. But understanding the impact that COVID has had on our education workforce is part of what ensures that we're going to get some support around this, because there were some real issues arising. Appreciation was a particularly interesting finding from the research, and I think this speaks to something that you all should feel tremendously proud of, actually. Under the circumstances that people are in and under the pressure that people have been operating in, by and large, the workforce has felt really appreciated by their senior leadership team and by their colleagues. Now, historically, we haven't asked exactly the same question, but I would our sort of feeling is based on the different types of data we've looked at in the past. This sense of feeling appreciated in the school feels much stronger to us than it has historically. And I think this has been true in a lot of workplaces where the leadership has really had to grapple with and has tried to do what they can to demonstrate to staff that they are cared for and that there is concern about their well-being. I've talked to a lot of different institutions, whether they're schools, colleges, indeed universities. And in those instances where there's been a really clear strategy and people have been concerned about the individuals and the impact of this situation on the individuals, the corollary of that has been that the individuals, the workforce, have felt tremendously appreciated. They felt seen, and their kind of commitment to the work has been positively impacted by that sense of appreciation. So I think there's a huge debt owed to our school senior leaders for being able to bring the whole of the workforce with you on this, you know, extraordinary kind of journey, if you like, through all these unknown factors. That sense of appreciation matters because it feeds directly into people's job satisfaction and their own sense of purpose, and that directly affects their resilience. And so whilst nobody is going around appreciating colleagues in any kind of cynical way, one of the side effects of it is that it builds resilience. And in building resilience, we are better equipping everybody in the school to deal with and manage and be able to digest what's going on. There are some questions for me around who's appreciating the senior leaders. And one of the things we didn't ask that we ought to have asked in this survey was around governing bodies. The extent of governing body support for senior leaders can be variable. And I think it's something we need to investigate a bit more closely. But what we did see coming back from schools was, although I will say that the head teacher responses to the appreciation question were actually even more positive than the workforce. So actually that would suggest that the governing bodies are supportive of senior leaders and have been at this time. I'd be interested to hear if anyone's got any comments to throw into the chat around that, if that feels right. Where there's been a really low sense of appreciation has been from the wider, from the parent community has been okay. People have felt that the parent community has appreciated the work that the school's done, but much lower levels of sense of appreciation from, unsurprisingly, the general media in particular have not come out of this as being champions of the education system or the workforce. And also there's a very low level sense of any appreciation or understanding from government. So government also hasn't come out of this well. So there's some things that we can take forward and advocate for better support for the profession, along with the unions and other partners who we work with routinely. But I think the point I really want to land with you is the positivity in schools, and that is directly impacting how, as a whole, the education sector is able to respond to the demands that are placed on it at the moment. A big theme that came out, of course, was testing. I won't dwell on this. We all know why testing is so important. And educators since July were flagging that there was insufficient testing available in order for people to feel safe to carry on their work on school sites. We asked educators about the challenges they faced, and they talked about work completion. So in the secondary school settings, how to have certainty, how to ensure that students would engage with the work and get through the stuff that they were being asked to get through was a real challenge and a worry for the workforce. The timeliness of government guidance and the amount of revision that went into government guidance was a big problem. This is most acute in England compared to Scotland and Wales. And Northern Ireland, we don't have enough data on to be able to have a clear picture of what happened in Northern Ireland. On the workload front, of course, workload has been vast. And in particular, this burden has fallen, and we've seen this in through a variety of data sources, if you like. The workload on senior leaders has, of course, been massive. And we can come back to that a little bit later on. In terms of transitioning in and out of lockdown and a lockdown where schools were closed, the concerns people had were around a subsequent spike in infection rates. Again, clarity and timeliness of guidance and the assessment process. Clarity about how the assessment process would roll out at all levels has been cited for months by the education profession. And in terms of support, what educators say they want and need is support around health and safety. There's a really fundamental piece here of, am I safe in my workplace? When I go in on a day-to-day basis, how safe am I? And how do I assess the risks that I face? And what is the appropriate response to take? That continues to be a big issue for educators. You only have to, log on to EduTwitter to see the amount of conversation about masks or not masks and different protocols in different settings. But health and safety rightly continues to be a core focus for people working in schools. Clarity around learning priorities and how assessment is going to work continues to be an area that people want support on. And then alongside that, how they can support the mental health of pupils. And if not support, at least recognise and understand where they can signpost. And again, educators get really frustrated if they're trying to signpost into mental health services that just don't have capacity to deal in a timely way with the issues arising. So the appropriateness of our wider mental health provision continues to come up as an issue for the profession. And then more broadly, CPD, particularly around blended learning and how to use technology. There's a lot of educators who would like a lot more support with how to make that work. So that's what we found when we asked the profession about education, about their experience in the pandemic. This is the only graph I'm going to show you from that research, and it, on the one hand, seems like a real truism. You're thinking, well, why are they telling me the blindingly obvious? And on the other hand, there isn't lots of this in the literature, so it's really important that we log that we have this evidence and we've got good data to support it. We asked people to classify themselves in terms of how they felt, whether they felt they had high, medium, or low levels of resilience personally. And then we asked questions about whether their experience in lockdown had been that their mental health had improved, whether it had made actually no difference to them, or whether their mental health had declined in that time. And so what we see really clearly is that the people who describe themselves as having high resilience have the least negative impact on their mental health from lockdown, from this experience. And those who have lower levels of resilience have a much greater negative mental health impact. And that's really important because we can start to then think about and understand what we need to do in our school settings. What we know is that when demand increases, resilience decreases. There's a lot of evidence in the literature to show that additional demands placed on people in a work context can drive down their resilience, can erode their resilience over time. And then what the graphic just shown you indicates is that when resilience drops, mental health declines as well. So this is a relationship between resilience and mental health, and resilience and the extent of demand on people, that we need to be thinking about in all of our workplace settings. Resilience, there's lots of different elements to resilience, but I think one of those that I think is most important for us to think about in this context is the nature of protective resilience. And by protective resilience, I mean, it's a bit like, having petrol in the tank before the light starts flashing. There are all sorts of things that we can do that basically make us stronger, increase our own personal resilience. And we can then draw on that resilience in times of difficulty. But if our underlying resilience levels are quite low and we go into a difficult situation, we obviously have a much lower reservoir to draw on. And so we can do what we're trying to do in a situation like this, which is to support people almost in an acute way. And part of that support is trying to address the underlying resilience. But our most positive approach really is to try and get people to make choices that are going to support themselves. And that's not about making people responsible for being okay in a really difficult circumstance. That's absolutely not what I'm getting at here. It's more around self-care. If we can get people to prioritize looking after themselves, then that's going to increase their own personal resilience. And I wouldn't be looking for people to increase their resilience so they can do more for the system. Actually, we want people to increase their own resilience, to give them a buffer and help them get through a time where there might be more demand than they're comfortable with. So we might come back and talk about that a little bit further. What can we do with all of this? Because I'm acutely aware, one of the reasons that this slot is the beginning of the day is because I present this very grim picture of the world, and you'll have to forgive me for it. Part of the reason I do it is I think it's important that we understand the context we're operating in and actually the seriousness of it. Because if we take that in and really allow ourselves to understand and acknowledge what it means, I think we're far more likely to allow ourselves and to encourage others to make really good decisions and better decisions, and actually to prioritize well-being, genuinely prioritize it. So that's partly why I set the scene in that way. But in terms of how do we address this, at Education Support, we talk to policymakers and actually to everybody in the sector about addressing this at 3 different interacting levels. Now, I was never very good at geometry. I'm sure I could probably have come up with a better shape than the triangle with the stars in the corner, but there you go. That's the extent of my my graphic skills. But the 3 elements that interact as we see the world are the individual, the workplace, and the system. And I would contend that you can try and make changes just here, but actually that doesn't necessarily make a difference to Mari in the school down the road. You can try and just directly deal with Mari, but you're only ever able to address the things that are directly in the control of the individual. And you can try and change the workplace or make the workplace the most supportive or a more supportive than it currently is environment, or incrementally improve what happens at the level of workplace. I would say we need all these 3 things working together. We need to be able to support individuals. We need to be able to help workplaces to move collectively toward a better footing, if you like, on the well-being front. And we can only do that when there's also change in the system, because the workplaces, of course, are responding to what the system asks them for, and then doing that through bringing a collection of individuals together. So we need each of these 3 elements to move together in tandem if we want to make sustainable progress, I think, on this agenda. And that's kind of how we see the world of education support. So I'll talk very quickly just about what some of that means, and I won't get into it in too much more detail, but I'll put my contact details up at the end of this. As I say, we're going to be doing as much as we can across Wales for the rest of the academic year. So if these are points that interest you, get in touch, either to help me understand how we're seeing this wrong and what else we need to be doing, or to help us see what maybe some of the solutions might be or some of the improvements might be. At the level of system, I think we talk about accountability. I'm not going to get into it, you live and breathe it, but an accountability system, I'm agnostic as to how accountability works from an education perspective, but where I have a strong view is that if the accountability system is designed in a way that's punitive, in a way that is high stakes, then we can't but understand that that must drive well-being in schools and colleges. That's just the long and the short of it. Because as the pressure comes down from the system onto the leadership push that down through the school or the college. We've seen it happen all over the place. We know it's a truism. I know that this is being looked at in Wales. I know that Eston, that inspections have been paused, but moving ourselves toward an approach to accountability that is genuinely supportive of individuals working in schools, that has a positive aspect to it, rather than the kind of more punitive ways that inspection can go to, I think is really key. And accountability matters because it drives behavior across schools. I think that's one of the areas and one of the levers that's most important from a system level. Professional identity and trust. So over time, whenever we talk to older generations of educators, they will describe a very clear transformation in how the profession is seen, in the extent of respect for educators, in how they themselves and their own professional identity is shaped, and how it's changed over time, not for the better for the most part. We think that it's really critical at a system level that the ability of educators to influence what's happening, to have voice in policy making, and to be involved in decision making is really, really key. Again, we see Wales doing this considerably better than happens currently in England. And so, you know, locally, Wales is making a better fist of this, but I think we've got further to go before we really make sure that we have taken, you know, really made the most of the professional identity of educators. We have this profession, and obviously it's heaving with people who've gone into it to make loads of money, because that's why everyone becomes a teacher, right? or to wield great power. You know, we have this workforce that is there because they want to make a difference to the lives of children and young people. This is the most wonderful resource that we possibly could have. And we need to make sure that within the system that is given the appropriate amount of influence, and not just, as we hear from educators over and over again, not just the same people, not just the same voices and the same schools being able to influence, but a much wider set of viewpoints involved in the system. Workload, there's more to be done on this. I'm not gonna, you know what that is, I'm not gonna get into it. If there are other things that you think are really key around the system, please share those with us, because the more insight you share with us, the better we can make do a job of advocating for change. So please do help us improve that. At the level of workplace, you know, having a good well-being and mental health strategy for the school with some clear measures of success. The critical thing of workplace is around culture and leadership. This really, really matters. You know, and culture is a variable from one school to the next in the system. It's one of the things that we see that's different. And it's about values, it's about behaviors, it's about beliefs and the social norms in a particular school. And the leadership style, whether that style is open and promotes relationships and collegiality, that's a very different school from one that is quite hierarchical and top down and, you know, sort of speak when you're spoken to environment. This really matters to the well-being of everyone working in it, including the leaders. When we talk to educators about their workplace, 49% of them will say that the workplace has a negative impact on their personal well-being. And actually, I think it's like 53% of leaders will say it. So leaders experience it even more as a negative on their well-being. So there is something really inherent in school culture and school leadership that matters here. And I think we've got some phenomenal examples of good practice up and down the country that we can learn from. But this is an area, if you were going to focus on one thing in the workplace, looking at the culture and leading toward the most collegiate, relational, respectful culture is, I think, one of the things that makes the biggest difference to the well-being of everyone, including the leaders. Line management, just to highlight, probably the single thing that makes the biggest difference to an individual in their place of work. So the line management relationship is really key. And when it doesn't work well, it has a disproportionate impact on the person who's being managed. I mean, it also can have on the one who's managing as well. Any of us who are leaders will have been in situations where a difficult line management situation took a massive toll, and it really does. But it's something that as leaders of schools or of any organization, actually you need to try and find ways to understand how the line management relationship is working and to intervene when it's not working well, because the impact on well-being is so significant. Other things that are important: having a baseline, understanding how staff are feeling, doing the risk assessments, having the right policies and practices, making sure that staff have access to counselling as appropriate, and that there's a baseline of knowledge across the school around mental health awareness, resilience, good communication styles and good feedback styles. And again, for line managers, supporting line managers in this context more than ever, to understand mental health and how to be a good manager with that lens, if you like. In terms of individuals, workload, I think one of the things that's so problematic with workload is often less the volume and more the type. And we don't understand enough yet about the type of workload that senior leaders are operating at the moment, how it's affecting them. We know it's not what senior leaders would define as the reason that they are in the role that they're in, dealing with a lot of the issues that are arising now, that are community issues, that are maybe spending the weekend trying to trace contacts because there's been a COVID positive case in the school. Or dealing with excessive parental pressure because the parents think that there's too much happening to be COVID secure, or there's too little happening to be COVID secure. That's a really difficult time right now for senior leaders, and I can't say we understand enough of it. But if we step back, what we know is that the type of workload matters, and where educators, and this includes senior leaders, are engaged in the work that they feel is purposeful, that matters to the outcomes for children and young people, then that isn't really a burden, actually. The stuff that is a burden is very administrative, and where it's much harder to make the direct connection to what's happening for children and young people. So wading through a lot of difficult guidance, for example, if that guidance hasn't been made easily digestible, that's the kind of thing that really exhausts and has a negative impact on the well-being of our leaders. Autonomy, demand and control, you know, there's a relationship between those two things. And if we're in a high demand situation and we have very low levels of control, that's a very difficult place to be, and that drives down our own sense of job satisfaction. So the only two things we can do there is try and minimize the demand or try and increase our control. And in terms of how we might do that, in terms of decreasing demand, actually in this environment with as much going on as is, the only thing we can do is choose to not do certain things. And that has to be in conversation with a supportive line management infrastructure. Or that you just take the decision that, you know, as a school, we're simply not going to do this because we're focused on this other important priority. And in terms of control, I think this is particularly difficult when we get into issues around what happens when there's a case of COVID in the school. But there are certain things that are in our control as leaders, and there are other things that are outside of our control. Trying to find and trying to, for yourself, work out where that boundary is of where you're responsible for something and where you're not is particularly problematic now in this context. And I think it's one of the places where if we can bring leaders together as peers, there's an awful lot of sharing and learning that can happen across the leadership community about how different people are handling it. And I imagine a lot of you are already having those conversations. And if you're not, then one of the most important things you could do at the end of today is put a call in to a couple of leaders that you know and just try and understand how they're addressing and dealing with these issues. The emotional content of our roles is also important. For some of us, there will be a very high, there'll be times that maybe that it's a particular time, or it may be that there's something specific happening in the community, or it may just be that there's a collection of things happening with individuals in the school. But when the emotional content of the day job is very high, it's really important that we have support in order to kind of process and debrief and let that go. And again, this is one of the services that we're offering through this program. So if that's of interest to anyone here, flag it up to us and we'll put you on the list. But supervision, external supervision can play an important role here. There are other ways of doing it within schools, but most of the time, educators either don't do it or they take it home and talk to their family about it. And I think where the family is supportive, where the personal relationships at home are supportive and able to digest that, that's great. But there are many contexts where there are not. And so my real concern is that for anyone who's carrying actually quite a lot and hasn't spoken to anyone, those are the people we need to be concerned about, because, you know, you can't keep just shaking the can and not expect it to explode. And that's a bit of where we are in all of this. We have, irrespective of the program of work we're doing here, we have a helpline for everybody working in education. And it's not about being in crisis, actually. We encourage people to use that helpline just to have a conversation. Sometimes we find ourselves more full of feeling or just off kilter, and reaching out and having a conversation with somebody who you don't have a personal relationship with, where it's an independent, confidential service, can be just a bit of a valve to let some of that fizz out of the can before the can explodes. There's also something to be said here about our individual choices. My own team are bored hearing me say this, but you know, when lockdown started, I had to look in the mirror and recognize that my own unwillingness to take aerobic exercise was probably going to become problematic over an extended period of being in the house with my small children. And whilst I can be outstandingly good at self-care when it comes to rewarding myself with food and drink, you know, I'm really, really good at that. I can make the choice to celebrate really easily. That's a strength, personally. I'm far less good at making the personal choice to take aerobic exercise, even though I work in this field and I know that exercise is directly linked to how I feel. I still have difficulty overcoming my own reluctance and resistance to it. And nobody should judge me for that. It's not really anybody else's business. And I don't expect anyone to point the finger and say, well, you know, Sinead, the reason you're feeling a bit rubbish is you didn't go for a run. In fact, you didn't even go for a walk, because it's not anybody else's business. But it is for me as a leader to reflect on that and to think, okay, What little small choice can I make today that puts me in a better place, that contributes to my own resilience, so that, you know, I'm in a better place, not for anyone else actually, but just for myself. I want to say something quickly about self-care. And self-care is it's a funny thing, and I don't know how much you'll have talked about this in the past with other people. Self-care is not self-indulgence. And this is a perception that I think persists, particularly among leaders, because, you know, the reason we're leaders is we're strong, right? That's what we do. We're really strong. We shoulder things. We get other people through it because that's who we are and that's what we do. But actually, in a situation like this, there's only so long that we can do that for. And then we have to recognize that we need to put some petrol in the tank, because we don't want to get to a place where the tank is, you know, the light is on the dashboard flashing red. It is not selfish to look after yourself. By caring for yourself, you're actually investing in your own ability to stay strong over the coming year. So if you're thinking about it as a kind of a professional point, you know, it is an act of good professional practice to look after yourself. That's just a kind of a truism. And the analogy for me is an athletic one. You know, I think of you, each of you here in your roles in schools, I think of you as elite athletes in the field of relationships. You know, that's what you do. We know from the research base that leaders have a critical role in outcomes for children. You are the people who lead the cultures in the places that you are, in your individual schools. And so your well-being is really, really key to your whole community, actually. And I don't say that in a way that is meant to make you feel under yet more pressure. I say it because I want you to feel really justified and totally comfortable in looking after yourself. So if you are an elite athlete in this field of relationships, actually your conditioning for your role is to look after your physical health, your mental and emotional health, and your spiritual health, whether that's spiritual in a religious sense or whether it's spiritual in the sense of connecting with your own purpose, you know, what makes you get up in the morning. There are lots of things that you cannot affect. You can't change how the government's going to deal with COVID. You can't bring forward better, quicker guidance on the things that really matter to your staff. You can't feed every child that is hungry in your community all the time. You can't do all those things, but you can take yourself seriously and you can take care of yourself. Being kind to yourself is proven in the academic literature to make a real difference to how you feel and how you perform, if you want to put it in performance terms. But there's a lot of evidence that shows us that self-compassion and kindness, just common humanity for the self, is strongly correlated to having far fewer mental health symptoms like anxiety, like depression, like stress. So find some time in the day and do something just for yourself, something restorative. And I can hear, you know, I can imagine you're thinking, what is this woman going on about? Where does she think I'm going to find this time? You know, every moment of my day is accounted for, either at work or the slivers of time I spend with my family. And I do understand that. And I would also say, let something go at work. It can be 5 minutes. Just take 5 minutes if that's what it is. But in doing something for yourself, something restorative, that is a really important act of professional practice. So I really encourage you to take that seriously and to think about what it is that you personally could do. I'm going to draw to your attention some of the signs that are important for us to watch out for in ourselves and in others. You know, nobody sits down, well, some people do, but very few people sit down and think, oh, I think I might be a bit anxious. Much more, we have this heavy feeling in our chest, or we're really tired, or we feel a bit sick, or we want to cry. Those are the symptoms that, and clusters of these symptoms are the things that tell us that actually maybe I'm not in the best shape and maybe I should speak to somebody. And I would again encourage you, if you notice those symptoms in yourself, reach out and speak to someone. If you see them in another person in the school, have a chat with them and encourage them to talk. You just need to listen. You know, all we need to do in these circumstances is a little bit of empathy. We don't need to have solutions, but sometimes just allowing somebody to speak and to hear themselves speak makes a massive difference, and that applies to you as well. I can't let you go without telling you, you know, the kind of cores of mental health hygiene. This is the grandmother's sucking egg slide. Forgive me, but there is evidence for all this stuff. Exercise fundamentally makes us feel better. You don't have to go out and do an Ironman. You can just walk around the block. That makes a difference. If you're not currently walking around the block, start there. Nutrition, making sure you have a good balanced diet, going easy on the sugar and alcohol. You know, particularly when that's around treating ourselves or altering our mood or trying to draw a line between work and home or whatever. Just try and keep an eye on that particular, your consumption there. Having good sleep habits, using social media wisely. So there's nothing wrong with using it. I think it's how we use it and being thoughtful about what we're following and what the noise is, whether it's positive or negative, and the balance of that. Gratitude. You know, small victories go a long way. And in this context, small victories are kind of the ones that we have to cling on to. So allow yourself to see them and allow yourself to feel the gratitude that goes with that. Again, it sounds a bit wishy-washy and I find myself, I'm shocked sometimes to hear myself saying this, but in the literature, there's great evidence that allowing yourself to see that, you know, to see those small victories and feel gratitude matters a lot and directly improves your well-being. Be creative. You don't have to be a Van Gogh. You know, being creative might be, in my case, learning to grow a few herbs without them dying. That's my act of creativity. There's lots of different things that we can do. Talk about your feelings. It may not be, for those of us who are, you know, I'm in my mid 40s, and talking about feelings, you know, it sort of started to be okay when I was a little bit younger. But it didn't grow up with any of this being okay. And I think many of us haven't grown up with it being okay. But the more that we learn, the more we realize it's critical to be able to voice how we feel. Because if we don't put words on it, sometimes those feelings, they always come out one way or another, whether it's in our behavior, in actions that we take to ourselves, or if they burst out in an unexpected way. But learning to talk about our feelings is a really important thing for us all to do. Accepting uncertainty. Uncertainty is really, really difficult, and we're all feeling it right now. And it can lead to anxiety and it can lead to fear. In some ways, letting go of trying to control it and letting go of trying to second guess what's going to happen when, you know, I've given up thinking beyond a week in front of me, to be honest, because I don't know, I can't control all of that stuff. So all I can do is the right thing right now. And it's not that I can't think a little bit ahead, but for the most part, actually, it's not helpful because there are too many unknowns. And letting go of the notion of being able to control it is quite helpful. And then recognizing that a wide range of responses is actually normal is really helpful. We can accept a wide range of responses in these circumstances. These are difficult times for people. The charity, what do? You can find out all this stuff on our website. We have support and advice for people. We have a helpline. We deal with 15,000 cases a year through that. The helpline's for a conversation, not just for a crisis. In that 15,000 cases, we've dealt with the gamut of things. You know, we've had almost 600 cases of people who were clinically assessed as being at risk of suicide from the profession, from the education workforce, through to the people who ring us up on Christmas Day to ask what the right temperature is to cook a turkey. So, you know, there's a really broad remit there. Our team is all trained counsellors. It's confidential. No one's going to know you've used the service or your staff have used the service, so please do. We also can offer financial assistance to educators in distress. We have wellbeing services for schools and local authorities, and we do this research and advocacy work trying to improve the system for everybody. So that's the work of the charity. This is the helpline number. Use it liberally. Invite everyone in the school to phone up whenever they want to have any kind of chat. That's what we're here for. All the information about our grants and other resources and services and stuff is on the website. And whoops, there's my email address. I promise that. Again, you will have Jennifer's email address in your inbox. So you can email Jen and she'll get in touch with any of us. And I should stop talking now, Jen, shouldn't I?
I would never say that, Sinead. Thank you very much. I hope that you all found that extremely informative. couple of comments in the chat that I'm going to touch on very briefly. I know that many of you will be wanting to get to the next session, so we're going to wrap this up in a couple of minutes. But just to confirm, we will be sending the slides round to participants, and there will also be a video recording that will be made available to you as soon as today wraps up. To your point, Sinead, about working more closely with governors to support leaders and head teachers in particular. We had a comment to say that in Carmarthenshire, there's been an online meeting for the chair of governors on how they can support the head teacher, which went down extremely well. And that they're looking to run that session again for those people who might have pastoral leads, which I think is really, really interesting. And that's definitely something that we'll take away as good practice. So that was really a very helpful comment indeed. And then just very briefly, Gareth has asked, does anyone have or is willing to share an example of a wellbeing baseline survey for staff to identify how they're feeling in the workplace and what anxieties they have? And any advice there, Sinead?
Gareth, I will ask my colleague Anthony to reach out to you, and we can share something on that. We're just looking for the work that we're going to be doing across Wales, what questions we use. We'll be using some of the stuff from What Works Wellbeing, who are speaking later today, but there is a set of baseline questions that can be used. So if you're comfortable with us following up, then I'll get my colleague Anthony to get in touch with you to talk about that.
Great.
Awesome. Great, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm very sorry that we're going to have to bring this to a close, mainly because I have to go and open another session and we've got to start recording it. But I would just like to say a massive thank you, everyone, for being here and for participating. And I really hope that you got a lot out of the session.
Jen, just to respond to Gaynor, all the stuff that we're doing in Wales, really delighted to share with all of you. So Anthony Priest is leading our work in schools. We will email you after this conference and we'll say to you, if you're interested in hearing from Anthony or being involved in that, give us a shout. So we'll push that information out to you and invite you to say, you know, yes, please, I'd like to do that. I think from a GDPR perspective, we have to make sure we ask you that way around, but yeah, we'll do that. Sorry, Jen.
No problem. And I've just posted a link to a feedback survey. And if you're quick enough, you'll be able to click on it. But don't worry if you're not, because we'll be sending it around after the session as well. Thanks very much, everyone. Hope to see you in sessions later on today. Take